Hi there, Sean Kevelighan here. Welcome to another executive exchange. III and FENIX24 recently joined up for a report which was examining real-world cyber incidents and claims data, and really looking at how organizations are prepared and perhaps how they're not as prepared as maybe they should be. You're seeing a lot of those kind of headline-grabbing ransomware incidents. They're actually not happening as much as the more financially driven attacks, in particular through business email. So today I'm pleased to be joined by Mark Grazman. He's the CEO of FENIX24. So Mark, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here, Sean.
Hey, good to see you again. So the report itself, it shows that, these ransomware, like I said, they're getting a lot of attention, but business email compromise and the funds transferring and fraud accounts are really a much greater problem. In fact, the report showed that about 56% of incidents now are through business email. What do you think in terms of organizations as well as insurance companies need to do to rethink their cybersecurity policies?
Yeah, I think, whether it's the business email compromise or even ransomware, most attacks start with hacking identity. And so, we do all the training for folks that we need to do, but there's never enough training, and there's more controls that organizations can put in place to really protect identity. We got good at making things efficient for ourselves and our administrators and our users. Now we have to, balance it's easy to use with really protecting identity. And the wire fraud, right? This is really about also just the human beings losing the context. And so really rigorous policies around verification of email wires and invoices and transfers are really important. I mean, what we know is that the threat actors, they're lazy. So they're going to do the least that they can in order to get money. And so when it's so easy to send in a fake invoice, right, or trick somebody from a business email compromise, that's what they do.
And it's one of the things we've said in the report is that insurers are in what we call a paradoxical position here because they have to set cybersecurity standards for their clients, but at the same time, they have to have the same standards as well, sitting on so much data as they do in this industry. We found through the report that many organizations feel as though they're well prepared. Whether or not that is reality is a question. What do you think in terms of the report's findings on the capabilities that are probably overstated?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, and carriers are, no different than everyone else from that sense that the traditional disaster recovery planning is anticipating fire and rubble, not an actual ransomware attack. So we, for example, as FENIX, right, we're the largest in the world at the hands-on keyboard breach response. So after the ransomware occurs, we get called in to fix things. And here's a statistic, Sean, that almost makes me drop off my chair. So now the ransomware has occurred, when the organization gets us on the phone and they tell us, don't worry, FENIX24, our data was immutable and therefore survived, there's an 84% chance they're wrong. So again, because the traditional compliance frameworks don't move at the velocity of the ransomware actors, all of our disaster recovery planning is really based on a data center going down or a fire and not actually what the threat actors are doing. And, there's a good and bad, right? When we think about carriers, and there was a rash of ransomware attacks and exfiltration attacks last year that hit a number of carriers. And, carriers are, as you say, equally responsible for the standards they give to their customers. And yet, we rely on carriers for stability of the economy. And, when we think of cyber insurance, the carriers are getting the detailed plans, right? Even the vulnerabilities of their clients. So we'd argue that, given their important role in society and the supply chain for all of us, they actually need a higher bar to protect themselves. And unfortunately, the traditional, what's published lags. So, we'll often talk about, and again, sometimes we use wartime analogies. So if you go, there's two militaries fighting, and one is looking down at a manual written 4 years ago, and the other military is looking at the offensive army and responding, it's obvious who wins. And that's a little bit of that state of why people don't understand what's likely to happen in attack, because the compliance manuals and the training frameworks are still focused on a different kind of a disaster than a human-driven ransomware attack. Then creates a really false sense of security for folks.
Well, I think that leads into one part of the report that emphasizes the resilience and the recovery aspect, but also not looking for the perfect prevention. So, what does that mean exactly in practical terms as CEO and boards are making cybersecurity investments and decisions right now?
Yeah, great question. So, we cut the world into two parts. How much is spent to resist attacks and how much is spent to have the capability to recover? And what we see is over 90% of budgets, macro, are spent on resisting the attack. And look, we think that's really important too. And I would have said this a month ago, but we're now, Sean, in the age of mythos, and AI just keeps accelerating. And what we saw with mythos, and again, just accelerated this, you cannot stop or put all your eggs in the prevent the attack basket. Human beings fall for tricks, right? Just as we said, the business email compromise can lead to, wire fraud, but can also lead to ransomware. And so given that spread, right, the compliance frameworks, operational resiliency are pushing folks to invest more to have that assured path of recoverability. I mean, literally, right? What Mythos did was it highlighted that with AI, bad guys or good guys, and let's hope it's the good guys that use these tools more, but we know how the world works, can find vulnerabilities even faster. So that's, our passion is you've got to pre-architect a path of assured recoverability, being realistic about what the threat actors do. Because they don't just go after backups, they go after the entire infrastructure. So they're going to take down backups and storage and identity and hypervisors. And that's part of that gap between traditional disaster recovery planning and what you really need to do to prepare for a ransomware attack. So this idea of, it's important to resist, but, I'd liken it to, you have a fire extinguisher in the building, but you also have a fire escape. And having, again, the focus to resist the attack does not preclude the need to make sure that if that attack is successful, that the organization can bring itself back online, keep its data, right, and keep running its business without massive interruption. And that's what we see happening in the press. Organizations aren't prepared for that, and they end up, being down for days or weeks or months, costing people, sometimes literally healthcare organizations costing lives, right? And when we think of insurers, when we think of health insurance, right? Imagine if a major health insurer went down and people couldn't access their care. We saw a version of that last year with United Healthcare and Change Healthcare. The impacts on society are really, really significant. We all need our carriers, right, to continue doing what they're doing and really being alert and leading the pack in terms of resiliency, recoverability, right, and setting a standard for themselves and their insureds that keep us all safer.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It is. It's a sense that there is an inevitability of this, right? In some form or fashion. If businesses don't think they've been attacked, what that means is they just don't know they've been attacked. Exactly. Or is the more reality of the situation. So when we're talking about the recovery, talking about the resilience, what in your mind is one action businesses should take most immediately based on the report so that they can avoid some of those pretty severe consequences of not taking the action they need to?
Yeah, great question. And this is a challenge because it's not well understood in the market what the ransomware actors do. But first thing they have to do is kind of recognize that traditional disaster recovery planning is not ransomware planning. And those are really different because you use the word disaster recovery and it sounds like that would cover all kinds of disasters, but it does not cover or help organizations prepare. So first thing you need to do is have a realistic third-party assessment that tells you what's really going to happen in the ransomware attack. And again, given where we started this conversation right around identity, they are going to get into and take down your email and your infrastructure and all of that. So you really have to anticipate that and be very, very cautious around identity and who's accessing the key administrative consoles in the organization. It's one thing if you've got, normal users, we can leave the normal users a little bit alone, right? They need, normal MFA, but administrative access becomes something you really need to change. then you also need to make sure that you're doing a lot of care and hygiene of the backups. So creating immutability, right, sounds easy. With some of the backup vendors, if you put immutability click on one thing, if the administrator can unclick it, so too can the threat actor. And that's something that, again, administrators often do is they create and make things easy for themselves, which makes perfect sense. But you have to assume if you, the administrator, can do it, so too will the threat actor be able to gain access and do the same thing. So you've got to make it so that even your own team couldn't delete out data without a very fixed time clock. So you got to create that immutability. You've got to protect the infrastructure, which really means protecting identity. And these are hard to do, right? We hope that most people listening to this aren't professional victims. So you need somebody who has gone through it and turn that into a third-party assessment because it is very eye-opening. I mean, our least favorite statistic is the one I shared, that false sense of confidence people have around the fact that their data is going to survive. And, even we in our, efforts to respond can't make data appear that the threat actors have deleted. And so we can bring a company back up to function, but if they've lost their historical data, many of them will never fully recover.
Yeah. Well, there's still a lot to be done, I think, is what the report is telling us. Mark, this is the part where you get to ask me a question.
Love it. Appreciate that, Sean. And, as we said, it's so important that the insurance industry, keeps pace. So, as the cyber insurance market continues to grow and threats evolve, what role do you see insurers playing in making sure that we all have stronger cybersecurity practices given the impact on the broader economy?
Well, I think, and I'll kind of turn this back on us at III as well, being an insurer-supported organization is, we do need to help inform a broader narrative about the issues happening here. What in particular, what insurance can do and what it can't. We're talking about resilience and we're talking about recovery. This has to be a mutual work with the customer, as well as the insurer, as well as the government. If you're looking at larger events, I know we're talking about smaller ones happening more frequently right now with business email, but if you're looking at, let's say, a systemic or a contagion type event that could potentially generate, billions and billions of dollars of losses, if not trillions, depending on what we're talking about, there's going to be a role of insurance that's limited. Now, the government has the terrorism risk insurance program, and that does cover cyber, but there's also a cap on that at $100 billion. And if you're looking at, comparing it to a pandemic-like event, you're looking at trillions of dollars of losses. So I think, understanding what we're talking about here today about what you need to do individually to help prevent and recover as well, but as well, what other players need to come together. We've been working as well with the Indiana University and MIT setting up a lab to discuss these types of things and to create research on them, because more awareness needs to be had in terms of what cyber insurance is, but also what others, businesses, individuals need to be doing to protect themselves and ensure that they can, in fact, recover. Mark, thank you so much. It's been great to work with you on this report. Appreciate you being with us here for the Executive Exchange.
Thanks. And again, I'll just reiterate, it is so important that insurers take this so seriously given the role they play. So again, we really appreciate III shining a light on some of the challenges and the opportunities for improvement.
That's great. Well, thank you all for joining us for this Executive Exchange. We'll see you next time.